44. Allied commanders faced their greatest crisis.
I can attack in 48 hours!
One general made an impossible promise. 250,000 men, 6 divisions, moving through winter storms. Surrounded troops heard something impossible approaching.
December 19th, 1944. Verdun, France. 3:47 in the afternoon. The steam rose from 23 coffee cups arranged around a scarred oak table in a stone-walled room that smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke. General Dwight Eisenhower stood at the head, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming a rhythm that matched no one's heartbeat. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains across a landscape that had already swallowed too much American blood. George Patton sat 3 chairs down, his polished boots reflecting the weak winter light filtering through frost-etched windows. His ivory-handled revolvers rested against his hips like promises. Inside his chest, something coiled, tight. Not fear, never fear, but the particular electricity that preceded action, the sensation a predator feels when prey stumbles into range. Eisenhower's voice cut through the murmur of worried generals. "Gentlemen, we're in one hell of a mess. The Germans have broken through in the Ardennes. We've got troops surrounded at Bastogne. I want proposals. I want solutions. And I want them yesterday." The room filled with the sound of men clearing throats, shuffling papers, buying time. Patton leaned back in his chair and the wood creaked like a gunshot. "When can you attack?" Eisenhower's eyes found him across the table. December 22nd, 48 hours from now. Patton's voice carried no hesitation, no qualification, just certainty, hard as frozen ground. The room went silent. Then someone laughed, a short, disbelieving bark that died quickly in the cold air. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior, closed his eyes as if in pain. Even Eisenhower, who had seen Patton work miracles before, looked as though he'd been struck. "George," Bradley said slowly, each word careful, "you're talking about pivoting the entire Third Army 90 degrees. That's 6 full divisions. Over 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, in winter, through the Ardennes, in 48 hours. "Yes," Patton said. He pulled out a small notebook already filled with calculations, movement tables, fuel requirements. The preparation had begun days ago, before anyone else had seen the disaster coming. The 4th Armored Division will lead. They'll strike north toward Bastogne. The 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions will follow. I've already issued preliminary orders." The silence stretched. Men stared at him as if he'd proposed walking on water. "It's impossible," someone muttered. Patton smiled, and there was something terrible in it. "The Germans think so too. That's why it will work." 300 miles north, in a snow-choked forest outside Bastogne, Private First Class Robert Fisher pressed his back against a frozen oak tree and tried to remember what warmth felt like. His feet had stopped hurting 2 days ago, which the medic said was a bad sign. The bandage around his left shoulder was stiff with frozen blood from a shrapnel wound he'd gotten when the Germans first punched through the American lines. Around him, the remnants of the 101st Airborne Division huddled in hastily dug foxholes, their ammunition running low, their food almost gone, their hope sustained by nothing but stubborn American pride and the promise that relief was coming. But relief was impossible. Everyone knew it. The Germans had them surrounded, had cut the roads, had the numbers and the momentum. The winter offensive that had begun on December 16th had caught the Allies completely unprepared, smashing through thinly defended positions with a ferocity that recalled the Wehrmacht's glory days. Fisher clutched his M1 rifle with numb fingers and watched German tanks prowling the tree line 400 yards away. Panzer foes, their long guns swiveling like the heads of hunting beasts. Behind them, he could hear voices. German soldiers preparing for another assault, confident in their superiority, certain that the Americans would surrender soon or die slowly in the snow. He thought about his mother in Cleveland, about the letter he'd written 3 days ago that would never be mailed. He thought about hot coffee, about the smell of his father's garage, about anything except the growing certainty that he would die here, in this frozen Belgian forest, surrounded and forgotten. Then, faint on the winter wind, he heard something that made no sense. Artillery. American artillery. Coming from the south. The logistics alone should have been impossible. To understand what Patton accomplished in those 48 hours, you must first understand what he asked his army to do. Imagine rotating a city the size of Toledo, Ohio, 90 degrees while it's moving at 30 miles per hour through a blizzard. Imagine keeping track of every vehicle, every fuel dump, every ammunition stockpile, every field kitchen, every medical station, every radio frequency. Imagine doing this while the enemy is actively trying to kill you, while the roads are ice, while visibility drops to zero, while men are dying from wounds and frostbite and simple exhaustion. The Third Army's operations staff had been planning for exactly this scenario, though almost no one else knew it. While other Allied commanders focused on the steady eastward push into Germany, Patton had been studying maps of the Ardennes, reading weather reports, calculating response times. He knew the Germans would try one last desperate offensive. He knew they would strike through the weakly defended forest. He knew with the strange prophetic certainty that sometimes seized him that he would be called upon to save the situation. At his headquarters in Luxembourg, staff officers worked through the night of December 19th under blazing electric lights that turned the operations room into a cave of harsh shadows and cigarette smoke. Colonel Halley Maddox, the Third Army's operations officer, coordinated the movement of 133,000 tons of supplies along roads that had never been designed for modern warfare. Every tank needed fuel. Every soldier needed ammunition. Every mile of advance required bridging equipment, medical supplies, radio batteries, replacement parts. "We're moving a division every 8 hours, Maddox said to no one in particular, his voice hoarse from shouting orders into field telephones. His uniform showed sweat stains despite the December cold. "This is insane. This is brilliant. This is going to work, or it's going to be the biggest disaster in American military history." The key was the road network. The Third Army would advance on 3 main axes, each requiring precise coordination to prevent massive traffic jams. Military police were stationed at every major intersection with orders to keep traffic moving at all costs. Units that stopped for any reason except enemy action would be bypassed and left behind. There was no time for caution, no room for hesitation. By midnight on December 19th, the movement had begun. Sergeant James Kowalski of the 4th Armored Division sat in the commander's hatch of his Sherman tank and watched the impossible become real. His column, 73 tanks strong, was heading north through darkness absolute, their headlights extinguished for fear of German aircraft, navigation done by compass and prayer. The road beneath them was a ribbon of ice. Twice already, tanks had slid off into ditches and been abandoned, their crews redistributed to other vehicles. The temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cut like broken glass. But they were moving. God help them. They were actually moving. Kowalski had been with Patton since North Africa. He'd seen the general's tanks race across Sicily, had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, had pursued the Wehrmacht across France. He thought he understood what Patton demanded from his men. But this was different. This was movement as violence, as defiance, as a middle finger raised to the gods of logistics and common sense. "How far?" His driver's voice crackled through the intercom. 60 miles to Bastogne, Kowalski answered. "Maybe 70, depending on the route. We'll hit German positions by dawn if we're lucky. Earlier if we're not." The tank lurched over a pothole. Inside, the crew braced against their stations, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The Sherman's heater barely worked, and frost accumulated on the inside of the turret, but they kept moving, following the tank ahead, trusting that somewhere up front someone knew where they were going. Behind them, stretching back for miles, the rest of the 4th Armored Division rolled north. And behind them, the 26th Infantry Division. And behind them, the 80th. All of it in motion, all of it converging on a single point, like a fist closing. Patton had promised 48 hours. It had been 23. In his forward command post, German General Erich Brandenberger stared at a map and felt the cold certainty of disaster settling into his bones. His 7th Army held the southern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive. For 3 days, the assault had gone magnificently. American forces had crumbled, fled, surrendered. The breakthrough had been achieved. Bastogne was surrounded. Victory seemed so close that Brandenburger could almost touch it. Then the reports had started coming in. American tanks moving north. Not a few. Not a probe. Hundreds of them. Entire divisions in motion. The intelligence seemed impossible, but it kept coming, report after report, each one confirming what Brandenburger desperately wanted to deny. "Patton," he said quietly. His staff officers exchanged glances. Everyone knew the name. The German High Command feared George Patton more than any other Allied general. They tracked his movements obsessively, built their defensive plans around his expected actions. Before the Normandy invasion, the Germans had been convinced that Patton would lead the main assault at Calais, a deception operation that had contributed to the success of D-Day. Now he was coming here, coming fast, coming with everything he had. "How long?" Brandenburger asked. "If the reports are accurate, he could strike our positions within 36 hours, maybe less. It's not possible. You can't move an entire army that quickly. The roads, the weather, the logistics." Apparently, the intelligence officer said quietly, "Someone forgot to tell Patton that." Brandenburger made his decision. Defensive positions would have to be established, reserves redirected. The assault on Bastogne would have to be intensified. If the Americans there could be crushed before Patton arrived, the entire calculus would change. Orders went out to division commanders, to artillery batteries, to tank units. But in his gut, Brandenburger knew. He'd studied enough history to recognize the moment when the tide turns, when audacity overwhelms caution, when a single commander's will bends reality itself. Patton was coming, and there was nothing that could stop him. Dawn on December 22nd broke gray and bitter over the snow-covered field south of Bastogne. Private Fisher, still alive against all probability, heard the sound before he saw anything, a rumble that built from distant thunder to proximate earthquake. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. German soldiers in the trees stopped their preparations and turned, their faces registering first confusion, then alarm, then something approaching panic. Then the American tanks appeared. They came in waves, their guns already firing, high explosive shells tearing into German positions with systematic violence. Sherman tanks might have been outclassed by German Tigers in direct combat, but Patton had never believed in direct combat. His tanks moved fast, struck from angles, concentrated overwhelming force on narrow frontages. Where the Germans expected methodical siege warfare, they got blitzkrieg in reverse. The 4th Armored Division smashed into the German lines like an axe into kindling. Infantry followed close behind, mopping up resistance, securing ground, pushing forward. The advance measured not in yards, but in miles. 7 miles on the first day, an unheard-of pace for winter warfare against prepared defenses. Fisher watched from his foxhole as American half-tracks roared past his position, their machine guns chattering, their crews grim-faced and focused. Relief had come. Impossible, miraculous, Patton-orchestrated relief had actually come. But the cost would be paid in blood. Sergeant Kowalski's tank took the hit at 11:32 in the morning. The German anti-tank gun was concealed in a barn 70 yards off the road. Perfect ambush position, textbook deployment. The shell punched through the Sherman's thin side armor and exploded inside the crew compartment. Kowalski was in the turret hatch when it happened, which saved his life, but cost him his left leg below the knee. He remembered the flash, the heat, the screaming. Then impact with frozen ground as he was thrown clear by the explosion. His tank burned with a fury that turned snow to steam in a 10-foot radius. Inside, his crew died in seconds. He tried to crawl away from the fire. His leg left a trail of blood, black against white snow. The pain was a living thing, a beast with teeth that sank deeper with every heartbeat. He could hear German voices, boots crunching through snow, coming to finish what the shell had started. Then American voices, closer, yelling, gunfire. Hands grabbed him, lifted him, dragged him behind cover. A medic appeared, young, terrified, competent. Morphine, tourniquet, pressure bandages, words Kowalski couldn't process through the gray fog closing in around his vision. "Stay with me, Sergeant. We've got you. We're getting you out of here." But there was no time for proper evacuation. The battle raged forward. The advance couldn't stop for wounded. This was Patton's war, momentum above all, victory through speed, breakthrough at any cost. Kowalski was loaded onto a jeep already carrying 2 other casualties. The driver was a private who looked 16, his hands shaking on the wheel. They raced south through artillery fire, through small arms exchanges, through the chaos that Patton had deliberately created. 20 miles to the field hospital, 20 miles over roads churned to muddy ice by tank treads. Kowalski faded in and out of consciousness, each bump a fresh agony, each breath a negotiation with darkness. They didn't put him in a queue when they arrived. There was no waiting line, no triage system designed to let less critical cases stabilize while surgeons handled the worst injuries. Instead, he was rushed directly to an operating tent where a captain with blood-stained gloves took one look at his leg and started barking orders. "Prep him now. He's got maybe 20 minutes before he bleeds out. Move!" Kowalski's last coherent thought before the anesthesia took him was pure shock. This couldn't be how the Germans handled casualties. The stories he'd heard about Wehrmacht medical care, the efficiency, the ruthlessness, the willingness to let men die if they couldn't fight again, that was supposed to be the German way, wasn't it? But here, in an American field hospital, surgeons were fighting for his life with the same ferocity that Patton demanded on the battlefield. Resources were allocated without hesitation. Time was spent without calculation. He mattered, not because he could return to combat, but because he was an American soldier, and that meant something absolute. The shock of that realization followed him down into unconsciousness. By December 26th, the siege of Bastogne was broken. Elements of the 4th Armored Division linked up with the surrounded 101st Airborne at 4:45 in the afternoon. The link-up point was a snow-covered crossroads marked by nothing except frozen corpses and the smoking wreckage of German tanks. American troops, gaunt and exhausted but undefeated, emerged from their positions to greet their rescuers with handshakes and hoarse cheers. Patton himself arrived shortly after, his jeep flying his 3-star flag, his bearing radiating satisfaction. He walked among the troops, shook hands, made crude jokes, radiated the absolute confidence that had driven the entire operation. He looked at the German dead, at the abandoned equipment, at the evidence of his army's achievement, and allowed himself a thin smile. In 72 hours, he had redeployed 6 full divisions across 100 miles of winter terrain while maintaining their combat effectiveness. He had struck the German flank with such speed and violence that enemy commanders were still trying to understand what had happened. He had achieved what Eisenhower hadn't believed possible, what Bradley had thought insane, what the Germans had considered utterly impossible. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month. The Germans would fight with desperate courage, but the strategic initiative had shifted. Patton had seized it in 48 hours and would never let go. Sergeant Kowalski woke up in a hospital bed in Paris 3 days after his surgery. His left leg ended in bandages just below the knee. The pain was manageable with morphine, the prognosis uncertain but hopeful. A nurse, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, 28 years old, from Sacramento, told him he'd been lucky. The shrapnel had missed the femoral artery by half an inch. The field surgeons had been brilliant. He would live. He would walk again with a prosthetic. He would go home. "I don't understand," he said through the medication haze. "Why? Why did they operate so fast?" I thought we couldn't afford to waste resources on guys who couldn't fight again. Lieutenant Morrison looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's not how we do things, Sergeant. Every soldier matters. Every life is worth saving. That's the American way. The American way." He turned the phrase over in his mind, examining it from angles he'd never considered before. All his life, he'd heard about German efficiency, about the ruthless calculus that made the Wehrmacht such a feared fighting force. He'd absorbed the propaganda without questioning it, the idea that American democracy made for weak soldiers, that our sentimentality was a strategic disadvantage, that caring about individual lives was a luxury we couldn't afford in modern warfare. But Patton had just moved 250,000 men in 48 hours. American surgeons had just saved his life without hesitation. American supply lines had just accomplished what German logistics officers thought impossible. And he was lying in a clean bed, being cared for by competent medical staff because someone had decided he was worth the resources. "We won, didn't we?" he asked, "at Bastogne." "We won." "Yes," Lieutenant Morrison said. "General Patton broke through. The siege is lifted." Kowalski closed his eyes and felt something shift inside his chest. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but a fundamental recalibration of what he thought he knew about strength, about efficiency, about what made an army truly powerful. The Germans had the tanks, the discipline, the fearsome reputation, but they'd lost to an army that valued its individual soldiers enough to race through a blizzard to save them, to operate on wounded men without calculating cost-benefit ratios, to fight not just for territory, but for the principle that every American life mattered. Patton understood something the Wehrmacht never would, that caring for your soldiers didn't make you weak. It made you unstoppable. In his diary, Patton wrote to his wife on December 27th, "Destiny called me in haste when things became tense. We moved faster than anyone thought possible, struck harder than the enemy believed we could, and achieved what all the doubters said was impossible. The Germans fear me, and they should. Not because I'm cruel, but because I believe in my men absolutely, and they believe in me the same way. That's a force no amount of armor can stop." He didn't mention the casualty figures. The hundreds of men killed in the advance, the thousands wounded, the tanks destroyed, the careers ended in frozen fields. That was the cost, and he'd paid it without hesitation because the alternative was worse. Hesitation killed more surely than boldness. Caution destroyed more than courage. He knew this with the certainty that other men reserved for religious faith. The maneuver that broke the Bulge became legend. Military historians would study it for decades, analyzing the logistics, the coordination, the sheer audacity. The Germans would remember it as the moment they knew the war was truly lost, when Patton demonstrated that American industry and organization could accomplish things the Wehrmacht's vaunted efficiency could never match. But for the men who lived through it, the significance went deeper than tactics and strategy. Private Fisher returned home to Cleveland in March of 1945. He'd been wounded twice more before the war ended, minor injuries that left scars but didn't disable. He carried other scars too, invisible ones, the kind that woke him at 3 in the morning with his heart racing and his hands shaking. But he also carried something else, a bone-deep understanding that he'd been part of something extraordinary. At the Bastogne reunion in 1951, he stood with other veterans and listened to speeches about courage and sacrifice. Someone mentioned Patton, dead now, killed in a car accident in occupied Germany, and the entire room fell silent in respect. Whatever else the general had been, arrogant, profane, difficult, he'd understood how to win, how to save men through audacity, how to value individual soldiers while demanding everything from them. Fisher thought about the German tanks he'd watched prowling the tree line. He thought about the sound of American armor arriving like thunder. He thought about the impossible made real through sheer force of will. 48 hours, he said to another veteran. That's all it took. 48 hours to change everything. The other man nodded. They said it couldn't be done. Patton did it anyway. That was the lesson, Fisher realized, the most important one. Not just about military tactics or leadership, but about what was possible when you refused to accept limits, when you valued people enough to risk everything for them, when you combined audacity with genuine care. The Germans had been efficient, ruthless, professional, but they'd lost to an army that believed something the Wehrmacht never could, that every single soldier mattered, that no one would be left behind, that American values weren't weakness, but the source of unbearable strength. The statistics tell part of the story. 250,000 men redeployed in 72 hours, 600,000 gallons of fuel consumed, 133,000 tons of supplies moved. 23,000 vehicles in motion simultaneously across a network of frozen roads never designed for modern warfare. Casualty rates that would make modern commanders blanch. 11,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing during the Bastogne operation alone. But statistics can't capture the psychological impact. The Germans never recovered their strategic confidence after the Ardennes. They'd thrown everything into one last desperate offensive and been stopped by a maneuver they'd thought impossible, executed by a general they'd learned to fear, representing a military system they'd fundamentally misunderstood. American soldiers learned something too. They learned that their commanders would move heaven and earth to save them, that they wouldn't be abandoned or written off, that individual lives mattered more than abstract efficiency. The contrast with Wehrmacht casualty calculations, the ruthless triage, the willingness to sacrifice formations, the cold mathematics of acceptable loss, couldn't have been starker. Sergeant Kowalski lived until 1998. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, the prosthetic leg a constant reminder of December 1944. He raised 3 children, worked as a machinist in Detroit, attended every 4th Armored Division reunion he could reach. In 1994, he returned to Belgium for the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. The battlefield looked different in peacetime. Green fields instead of snow, trees grown tall where forests had been shattered by artillery, memorials marking where young men had fought and died. He stood at the crossroads where his tank had burned and tried to reconcile memory with present reality. A Belgian man approached him, elderly, formal. "You were here?" he asked in accented English. "Yes." "December 44, 4th Armored Division." The Belgian man's eyes filled. "You saved us. You came when everyone said it was impossible. We thought we would die under German occupation, and then your general brought his army north faster than anyone believed men could move. You saved us." Kowalski thought about that word. Saved. Not conquered, not liberated through superior numbers or industrial might, but saved through a combination of audacity, logistics, and the fundamental American belief that people mattered. Soldiers, civilians, everyone. "We did what we had to do," he said. General Patton didn't believe in impossible. That night, alone in his hotel room, he wept for the first time in decades. For his crew, dead in a burning tank. For all the men who didn't make it home. For the cost of victory and the price of principles. But also for the pride of having been part of something that proved American democracy could produce soldiers every bit as effective as German authoritarianism, and more, because they fought for something worth the cost. The truth about Patton's 48 hours is both simpler and more complex than the mythology suggests. Simple because the tactics were straightforward. Concentrate force, move fast, strike hard, accept casualties in pursuit of momentum. Any competent general understood these principles. The genius was in execution, the logistical preparation, the communication systems, the calculated risks that somehow all paid off. Complex because Patton understood something profound about American military culture that escaped many of his contemporaries. He knew that American soldiers would endure incredible hardships if they believed their commanders valued them. He knew that the medical system that operated on Kowalski without hesitation wasn't weakness, but the foundation of military effectiveness. He knew that the democracy the Germans dismissed as soft and inefficient actually produced a military system capable of achievements totalitarianism could never match. The Germans built an army on obedience and efficiency. Americans built an army on individual initiative and the belief that every soldier mattered. When those systems collided in the Ardennes, the outcome surprised everyone except Patton himself. The legacy endures in unexpected places. Modern military logistics doctrine still references the Bastogne relief operation as the gold standard for rapid redeployment. The emphasis on individual soldier welfare, the medical care, the evacuation procedures, the refusal to write anyone off, became foundational to American military culture. The lesson that audacity combined with genuine care for troops produces better results than ruthless efficiency alone remains relevant, but perhaps the most important legacy is psychological. The generation that fought World War II learned that American democracy wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be leveraged, that caring about individual lives didn't make you soft, it made you fierce, that the values we claim to fight for weren't propaganda, but the actual source of military effectiveness. Patton understood this instinctively. He pushed his men to the edge of human endurance and beyond, but he also fought for them with every resource available. He demanded impossible achievements and simultaneously created systems that valued every soldier's life. The contradiction wasn't weakness. It was the secret of American power. In 48 hours in December 1944, he proved it to the world. Fisher, Kowalski, and 10,000 other soldiers carried that truth home with them. They built the post-war world remembering what American military culture at its best could accomplish. They taught their children about duty and sacrifice, yes, but also about the importance of valuing every individual, of refusing to accept what others called impossible, of maintaining principles even when they seemed impractical. The Battle of the Bulge could have gone differently if Eisenhower had been less willing to trust Patton's audacity, if the logistics had failed, if the weather had been worse, if German commanders had anticipated the speed of American response. But it didn't go differently. It went exactly as Patton planned, impossibly fast, devastatingly effective, purchased with blood, but ultimately successful. And in that success lay a lesson about what America could be when it lived up to its ideals. Not perfect, not without cost, but capable of extraordinary achievements when boldness and care combined, when individual lives mattered and collective action triumphed, when someone refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. Patton died in December 1945, less than a year after his greatest triumph, but the example endured. The maneuver that broke the Bulge remained proof that American democracy could produce military excellence matching or exceeding any totalitarian system, that caring for soldiers made armies stronger, not weaker, that audacity and humanity weren't contradictions, but complements. 48 hours. That's all it took to change the course of a battle, to shift the psychological balance of a war, to demonstrate truths that would echo through generations. The Germans thought it was impossible. Eisenhower doubted it could work. Patton made it happen anyway. And in doing so, he proved that the most devastating weapon in warfare isn't superior tanks or tactics, but the absolute belief that no challenge is insurmountable when you value your soldiers enough to demand everything from them and give everything for them in return.